Let me welcome everyone to the debate on wages for housework. It's going to be an exciting debate, I think. I am Beena Agarwal. I'm a professor of development economics and environment at the University of Manchester. Now, unlike Prabha Koteshwaran and Justice Sri Devan, I don't have a formal law degree, but I am self-taught in inheritance law. And as I was invited to teach a course on South Asian inheritance law at the NYU School of Law. So I mentioned this since today, in today's debate, we need insights on both economics and law. And our panelists have both legal experts and economists. Now, today's debate and the symposium held over the last 2 days, which many of you have been attending, has been organized largely by Prabha Koteshwaran and her team from King's College London under her project, Laws of Social Reproduction. And then we have important local collaborators, in particular iWage, which is headed by Dr. Soumya Mehta, and our very own FESDIG, the Feminist Economic Saturday Discussion Group. FESDIG, which I had initiated in November 2013, is now over 7 years old. And it is, as some of you know, is an informal forum of scholars based mostly in Delhi, who have been working on issues around gender and the economy. And we meet monthly to discuss our research in progress. Now, ILO Delhi generously allows us use of its offices. So Prabha and Soumya and many of the speakers in this symposium are also part of FESDIG, as are many of you who are attending today. Now, I might mention that the antecedents of today's debate, in fact, lie in a face-off. I'm using the word that was used by the newspaper, a face-off between Prabha and Ashwini Deshpande in the Times of India. And I thought this was exciting, and I suggested we should actually have a full discussion around it. And of course, Prabha took up the challenge. Regrettably, Ashwini could not join us on this panel due to personal commitments, but there are similar views that will be aired as part of the debate by others. So the question, how should we value and reduce women's housework burden, has had a long history. And over the decades, various solutions have been offered, from socialization of housework to wages for housework to mechanization of housework, and so on. Now, we know that the socialization of housework idea can be traced at least as far back as Frederick Engels' 1984 treatise, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. The solution offered by him and Marxists more generally was to make housework a state responsibility. Now, there were actual experiments of this on the ground. You may recall that Israel introduced communal child rearing in kibbutz a long time ago, and this continued, in fact, till the 1980s. And then China had set up communal kitchens in the 1950s. So on the one hand, in kibbutz, children, in fact, were brought up by state facilities. So there have been various attempts by the state these examples illustrate, to actually experiment with socialization of housework. But none of these experiments have worked. And in these cases, both in Israel and China, they returned most of the work back to the fold of the family. Not entirely, but mostly. Also, part of the history we must recall is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is a feminist economist, who demanded that housework should be shared equally by women and men. And this was in the late 19th century as well. But the idea of wages for housework gathered strength in the 1970s, and Selma James, who you will have the privilege of hearing today, was among the pioneers. But then, as now, it remained a debate, with some people supporting it and others opposing it. So is today any different? We need to ask that. And I believe it is different for several reasons. Some reasons are general and some are specific to India. So for instance, globally, the Wages for Housework campaign continues. It's something, again, that Selma was responsible for. And it's called, and there was the Global Women's Strike which was held on March 8 in 2000, which mobilized women from over 60 countries. Secondly, in India, we know that today politicians are actually discussing wages for housework as a real possibility. For instance, as you know, it was first discussed a few years ago, but today Kamal Hassan, who's the former actor turned politician, has promised in his manifesto that he will provide salaries for housewives if he is elected. But we can, of course, ask, would giving salaries stereotype women as housewives? Would it deter husbands from sharing the work, as some people are arguing? If salaries are given, should they be universal or should they be targeted to poor households? So these are all questions that are part of the debate. Third, today we do have, you may be surprised to hear me say that, but I think in some way we do have a partial socialization of housework, in that creches in many countries are provided free by the state. And also in some countries, like in the UK, the person providing elder care is paid. Now, in India, providing creches was made part of employer responsibility. It was included in the Maternity Benefit Amendment Act of 2017. The fourth reason why this debate has a newness is that we have many time use surveys today, which can actually measure the enormous gender gap in domestic work, and so enable us to make the argument stronger. Fifth, some might argue that technology has improved greatly to reduce drudgery of housework and could even make some tasks attractive to men. And then technology also allows flexi work time in some jobs or some kinds of jobs. And this again allows more cross-gender sharing of childcare and domestic work. Sixth, in India, we have legal judgments which actively give value to housework, such as cases relating to the Motor Vehicles Act, with Justice Sridevan, who pioneered it, and Prabha Kotishwaran, who's written about this very effectively, will speak about. Both of them are here with us today. Seventh, there is an active debate in India linking women's contribution to housework on the need to strengthen their rights in marital property via the community of property. So all these elements, some of which are new entries into the debate on wages for housework, enable us to actually look at it in a fresh way. And I hope that today's debate is not just an academic exercise, but that it's a real opportunity to provide pointers for framing transformative policy. So with those words, let me introduce the speakers. I'll introduce all the speakers in the beginning, and then we can have a free flow rather than interruptions. So first of all, it's amazing to welcome Selma James. She describes herself as an anti-sexist, anti-racist campaigner. She was part of the anti-colonial movement for Caribbean independence and federation. And in 1972, she put forward a demand for wages for housework and founded the WFH, Wages for Housework campaign, which coordinates the global women's strike, which I referred to a while ago. So she has also co-authored books, and she's especially what is considered a classic, The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community. She's authored the book Sex, Race and Class, and there's another book which is forthcoming, which is called, very appropriately, Our Time is Now, Sex, Race, Class, and Caring for People and the Planet. She's based in London. She's a grandmother, and we are very, very privileged to have her with us today. Dr. Prabha Kotishwaran is the main organizer of today's debate, and she's a professor of law and social justice at King's College London. She has written extensively on criminal law, on transnational criminal law, post-colonial theory, and feminist legal theory. And she's got several books, including Dangerous Sex, Invisible Labor, Sex Work and the Law in India, which was published by Princeton University Press, and then Governance, Feminism, and Introduction. And she's managing the project that I mentioned, Laws of Social Reproduction. Soumya Kapoor Mehta is head of iWage, and she's an economist by training, but she's worked for 18 years in the development sector, both in research and policy. She's researched gender, women's empowerment, poverty reduction, social inclusion, and so on. And she's been an independent policy advisor to a wide range of institutions, the World Bank, UNICEF, Government of India, CPR, and SEVA. And she has co-authored many research publications and 2 very well acclaimed books. Then we have Ritu Devan, who's a professor and director. He was a retired professor and director of the Department of Economics at the University of Mumbai. And she's also currently visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development. She has been president of the Indian Associations for Women's Studies, the vice president of the Indian Society for Labor Economics, and vice president of the Indian Society of Agricultural Economics. So she covers a wide domain. And she's written extensively on gender and economics, labor markets, trade, green growth. She's now working on environmental issues too. And then we have a very special guest today, Justice Sri Devan, who served as a judge of the Madras High Court from 2000 to 2010. And after retiring, she was appointed as the chairperson of the Intellectual Property Appellate Tribunal Court from 2011 to 2013. And as a High Court judge, she dealt with several acclaimed, celebrated cases. But for us in particular, she broke new ground in her judgment on the valuation of housework, which was linked to the Motor Vehicles Act. And again, we are very privileged indeed to have her here. She has a very busy schedule, so she may leave before we finish the session, but she has kindly agreed to speak. So the way I thought we'd structure this is that we would begin with the first round of statements by each panelist, about 10 minutes each. And then we'll follow it by a second round where panelists can respond to each other, 5 minutes each at the most. And then we'll open it up with Q&A and also comments from the audience, because we really have a very distinguished audience and very knowledgeable audience. So it won't be just Q&A, but also bringing their own insights to the debate. So with those words, may I request Selma to open the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And good morning. Just as the Indian cricket team is about to destroy the imperialists who are on the field of play, I'm really honored to be here and in such distinguished company, learning so much. Really, yesterday was an education, or all the time has been, and also a chance to exchange on an international level, which I believe is absolutely crucial to our future as a human race. I'm going to go very quickly to make my case. 10 minutes, I was thinking it was 15, but we'll squeeze it in.
Selma, can I interrupt you for a second, if you don't mind? This is to our participants. Please put your comments and questions in Q&A and not in the chat. I should have said this earlier. But the best place to put it is in Q&A. Chaya, if you could just cut and paste it and put it in Q&A, and that'll be great. So Selma, we won't rush you. And so don't drink too much water and don't get, please take your time.
Well, when the women's movement began, we searched for something which would unite us and which hit at the central questions of our situation, of our poverty, and of our lack of power in every area. And finally, we came to the conclusion that women reproduce and care for the whole human race and are poor as a result. This is the most extraordinary fact, and in a really crucial ways, it's a hidden fact. We don't hear about this. We don't even often think about it, but it has been central to our situation in class society generally, and we have to address it. And we decided, at least some of us decided, that the only basic solution to this crisis of poverty and overwork, often also outside the home and in the field, that we needed a wage for the work that we were doing. And we began to discuss it, first of all, in the women's movement. The result was that mostly feminists thought that it was a bad idea. It would institutionalize us in the home. Now, I can't imagine any situation which has institutionalized a group of people as poverty and dependence, which is a form of violence. Poverty and financial dependence have institutionalized us in the home and in the society generally as the caregivers, as the servants of men. We, as a result of the fact that we didn't have the approval of feminists, we went to the United Nations, but that was also because we felt we had to build a movement, and that movement had to be international. And when we went to the UN, we had some kinds of success. In 1980, an Indian woman named Krishna Patel, Dr. Patel, told us that women do 2/3 of the world's work for 5% of the income. She worked at the Office of Women Workers' Questions at the ILO. And we came out from 1980's conference with a new piece of information. But in 1985, we were much more prepared for the final conference of the UN Decade for Women. And we got a motion passed that women's work in the home, on the land, and in the community should be counted in national statistics. It was a breakthrough. And what made us win were the third world women from the South who were in the delegations. And they responded. They didn't have power in the delegations except marginally, but they used that to support what we were doing because they understood why they were in those delegations, that their position higher than most of us was to get the rest of us up from where we were. It was an amazing experience to work with them and to see how even in a secondary position, they were able to use their position to help us out outside. So we went to the women's movement again, to the feminists, and said, look at what work we are doing and what we are entitled to. We had something also in our background. In the 1960s and 70s in the United States, there was a massive movement of welfare mothers. That is the money that the state gave very poor single mothers to raise their children so that they didn't starve. And they formed a women's movement, and they were led by Black women in the cities, whereas it was white women in the countryside who made up the bulk of welfare mothers. And they were a massive women's movement which feminists never acknowledged. Now that tells you about the level of racism, including among women, including among feminists, that we must be aware of. But that movement gave us courage and understood that we were speaking for women at the bottom, and women at the bottom are most women. And it's really absolutely urgent to us that we are anti-racist from the beginning. Otherwise, we cannot build a women's movement. And it was a women's movement that we knew we had to form, and on an international level. So we began our campaign in a few countries, 2 or 3, but we had the US, and that's such an important base for a movement, because a lot of the wealth of the world is there. We don't have it, but it exists, and we help to create it, I have to say. We must be aware of that at every point. Yes, I have some difficulty with sight, so it takes me a bit of time, but I get the point. In response to really the opposition to what we were doing, we spoke with women. They were excited, but they needed money immediately. They couldn't wait for any wage for housework at a later point. And women massively went out to work in the industrial world. In the non-industrial world, women had often, almost always, been out to work on the land. And that work, of course, was not counted either. So that housework and work in the home and work which was for the community, none of that work was seen as work. I was very interested in what women yesterday and the day before too spoke about how much of the work was not counted. When we began with a group in Chhattisgarh, what we found out was that the bonded laborers, if they had wives and children, the work of the wives and children was what else? Not counted. It not counted to the debt. So in addition to being bonded, the women and children were fundamentally being enslaved as well. This was really a universal situation, not of bonding, but of poverty and dependence and the need and caring. And it was when the pandemic hit that we began to see, first of all, by that time we knew there was a crisis of care. People talked about a crisis of care, which meant that women had gone out to work, but the caring work, the work of reproducing the human race, the work of taking care of everyone, the work of keeping the society together, the work of the protection against all kinds of violence against their children and elders as well. All of that work was much less of it was done because the women were out getting a wage. And it was perfectly clear that the society had been dependent on women in a way that they'd never admitted, and still did not until the pandemic. And it was perfectly clear that it was the work of women, the caring work of women, that stood between us and death. They were saving lives. They were preventing us from being killed on an industrial scale. And that now is accepted as an important job which women have done. And interestingly, the work in the home of precisely of caring there is still hardly spoken about and never spoken about in relation to money. They thank you. Even at this moment in time, there's an issue in the UK where the carers who have been so absolutely vital to survival are offered a 1% pay rise. insulting, but sexist, unbelievably sexist, and not even referred to as that because they're workers, therefore they cease to be women. You know, we women have a lot of trouble keeping our identity visible. For example, many times, the fact that when they speak about violence in the home, they speak about parents being violent. It's not parents per se, it's men in relation to mothers most of the time. And the word mother also, I don't know how it goes in India, but in the UK, in the US, in a lot of countries of the West, the word mother is hardly spoken. It's as though this is our weakness. You know, the weakness is not that we are mothers. The weakness is how we are treated as a result of being mothers. And we as mothers do not want to be cut off from every possibility for our lives, for the work we would like to do, for the work we would like to learn about. But it does not mean that we should turn our backs on caring. It means that the whole society must see that the work of caring is absolutely fundamental to survival and fundamental to our relationships. Now, I want to speak for a moment about that. Caring is a relationship between those of us who are doing the caring and those of us who are being cared for. That's sometimes hidden because those of us who are carers are not always cared for. It is not a mutual relationship. But this is the kind of society that we want to build, not that we will. The remuneration for caring work is a way of positing our need to have a caring society where all of us are caring for all of us to the degree that we are physically and socially able to do it. Okay, I think in trying to
Caring income.
Yeah. Yes, in 2019, we were offered a gift. The Green New Deal for Europe, which acknowledged the debt that Europe must pay for the imperialism that they have imposed on most of the rest of the world, was given to us to read. And in it, we saw something called a care income. And Nina and I were sitting next to each other, working together, and we looked at each other and we said, this is the development of wages for housework. For the first time, the struggle for the reproduction of the human race and the struggle for the reproduction of the natural world and the care that each demands by the whole of society was put forward as a way of proceeding, as a way of, first of all, opening the world to the liberation of women and opening the natural world to the protection and to the care that it must have if we are to survive. And it was perfectly clear also that on an international level, it was women who were doing the caring in both cases. You have some examples of women in India who are now transforming agriculture to be preserving the soil as well as making it more productive. we have been working on the care income for some a year and a half or two now, and we see that it is able to bring what in the North is called two movements, that is the movement for ecological survival and the movement for women's liberation. But we know very well that in most parts of the world, that is one movement. India, at this moment in time, is a classic example, not of the coming together. They've always been together, but as an example to the rest of the world for these two aspects of caring to be dealt with together, to be struggled with together. Now, I want to say something about
Selma, another couple of minutes, and then we could have you on the second round. Yeah.
Yes. Merely to say that our organization, the Wages for Housework campaign organization, among domestic workers, some people, academics, waitresses, welfare mothers, etc., the organizations also have a number of autonomous organizations within them for lesbian women, for sex workers, for single mothers, for women with visible and invisible disabilities, etc. And we work together, but they have their own, or each has their own autonomous organization, so they can concentrate on that and bring that to the rest of us and have the rest of us to be supportive of them. I want to just say one thing in relation to what I have heard from you, and that is, please make a compilation, if one does not already exist, of the many ways in which women in India have already won some modicum of a payment for work, for some work, for a bit of work in whatever capacity, how much you all have already won, what the Wages for Housework movement in India fundamentally has won, so we will be able to celebrate and learn from those what we also in other countries should be demanding or may already be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelma, for that really sweeping from the time when you started till your position today, where you bring in the planet. I think it is somewhat contentious, the idea that women are the ones who are caring for the planet. I mean, I know it's an eco-feminist position, which I have particularly critiqued a great deal, but we'll come back to that. It is, after all, a debate. I think others will answer on have Indian women move further forward than women in other countries. But let me, with that, pass it on to Prabha. So Selma's position, as I read it, Selma, is that you are very much in favor of wages for housework, although you may term it in some other way, but some kind of economic compensation. And then particularly also you see it as an international project and linked to the Green New Deal as well. So if with those very few words, which I cannot summarize what you said, but that would be your position, right? That you're on the far side of the debate. Okay. Prabha, it's to you.
Thank you so much. I think, thank you, Selma, for that very inspiring talk, which was absolutely wonderful to hear. And it would be impossible to follow you in any meaningful way. But I will add a few thoughts that I'm working on as a thought experiment for all of you to reflect on and share your feedback on. So I argue that it is time for a Wages for Housework movement in India explicitly named as such. I think wages for housework is crucial and invaluable as a perspective, no doubt. But I want to go further and propose that we offer married women a state-funded, unconditional cash transfer for the unpaid domestic and care work that they do. This amount can be a basic amount, and its grant can be means tested. And these grants will not be in lieu of, but in addition to continued investment in public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and improved access to childcare, education, decent jobs, and workplace protection. And the primary reason for this demand is that it forces us to open up the black box of Indian marriage. Because in India, by the age of 30, 95% of women are married, and divorce rates are around 2.6%. The 2011 census actually shows that there are 160 million women with household work as their main occupation, but there are possibly more. So the Supreme Court in the 2010 case of Arun Kumar Agarwal put this number at 367 million. So this much we know, that Indian women are faced with compulsory marriage. Going into marriage, women's natal families typically give dowry to her in-laws and stridhan to her. If all goes well, she will perform countless hours of unpaid domestic work, bear children, and bring them up while taking care of elderly relatives. She will rely on the benevolence of her husband to meet her expenses. And if the marriage does not go so well and she considers divorce, she will soon realize that she has few economic rights. She has a limited right to maintenance, access to which is undermined by long waiting periods before courts for paltry amounts paid long after petitions have been filed, with husbands hiding their assets. She will have no access to property acquired by the couple over the duration of the marriage, to which the wife would have contributed with her unpaid work. And if she goes back to her natal home, she will likely be resented. She will anyway have difficulty realizing equal inheritance rights over her natal property. And she's also likely to lose her dowry and not retrieve her stridhan. Like in many other parts of the world, she and her children will be significantly more impoverished economically after divorce than during marriage. Now, in other parts of the world, we can think of prenuptial agreements and employment and tax devices to account for unpaid work. But these are unfortunately unrealistic in a country where most marriages may not be registered or documented, where more than 90% of the working population is in the informal sector, and where many families have no property to speak of. So in the absence of support from her natal family or marital family, it would make sense, I argue, for the state to pay wives during marriage rather than for wives to approach their husbands at the point of divorce or exit. Now, such a payment, again, is not an obstacle to reforms in family law to allow for a community property regime where income and property acquired by either spouse during a marriage belong to both partners. And this is because a baseline grant is nowhere near the replacement value of unpaid work, which one organization estimated to be $612 billion, nor is it close to the opportunity cost for, say, an educated woman who can still recover compensation for loss of income from her husband. Now, of course, these stark realities are not unknown to a lot of women in marriage, and most actually continue in marriage. Now, I argue that during the marriage, the grants that I propose will enhance their economic bargaining power. And the very idea of monetizing unpaid work will challenge the ideology of domesticity and could help a married woman set time boundaries on her unpaid work, challenging the sexual division of labor at home. She may even be able to resist domestic violence inflicted on her for not doing enough unpaid work. It may help her learn a skill. It may even help her exit marriage. Now, in Venezuela, where the constitution guarantees social security for housewives, women who receive payments in the Misión Madres del Barrio program reported that this payment would help them quit their low-paying jobs elsewhere and leave their husbands and spend more time on voluntary work. Now, eventually, these payments can be extended to girls so that they are not viewed as a burden to be married off. This may extend the period before which they're married and possibly help push back against the demand for dowry. Further, when divorced women return to the natal family, this payment will mean more support and less resentment from the natal family. Now, all I want to underline is that marriage continues to be the primary means of economic survival for most Indian women. It is further the hub of social reproduction around which revolve the spokes of various satellite economies. For instance, a majority of the women performing, abject forms of labor like sex work, erotic dancing, and even paid domestic work all enter such work because of the failures of marriage. There are other married women who undertake work as ashas, as Anganwadi workers, as school teachers, as health workers, because it fits around their unpaid care commitments at home. And paid work in every sector that I've mentioned so far is viewed as an extension of women's unpaid work, as intuitively feminine, as easy work, and therefore is highly devalued and underpaid. So recognizing unpaid work within the home will therefore have ripple effects for millions of women in each one of these sectors. And in India, wages for housework are hardly a utopian idea. If anything, it has been in operation in the state of Goa for 8 years already, inaugurated by a BJP chief minister nonetheless. And more recently, the government's cash transfer of 500 rupees for 3 months to poor women's Jan Dhan accounts post-pandemic and focus on LPG provision also suggests some awareness on the part of the state of women's role in managing households. But the payment of this grant, I submit, should not simply be a welfare handout. In Venezuela, for example, these payments are accompanied by consciousness-raising workshops on the gender division of labor. And significantly, there appears evidence that Indian housewives themselves are making political claims of the state and are organizing. So in 2012, an NGO approached the Kerala High Court with a writ petition demanding that housewives be paid a minimum wage. Otherwise, they argued that Article 23 of the Indian Constitution, which prohibits forced labor, would be violated. And their petition was rejected, not in the least because the court felt it did not have the power to make law. Now, housewives in Delhi have similarly formed an association and tried to register it as a trade union, which was refused. No surprise there, this happens to several groups of reproductive laborers. So the mobilization of housewives to articulate their own interests is thus already underway. So I want to conclude by saying that women's unpaid work subsidizes the state, capital, and patriarchy. It did so pre-pandemic, and this is even more the case post-pandemic. But the memory of the state is short-lived. So the 2021 budget slashed allocations for the Ministry of Women and Child Development, leaving Asha, Anganwadi, and health workers in the lurch. Similarly, a survey by Ravinder Kaur and Sonal Desai suggests that the gender division of labor is likely to return to status quo post-pandemic. And this was based on a survey of highly educated couples where both partners were employed. The state has leaned in on women for long enough, and the demands on our altruism are only increasing. So one example is the recent surrogacy bill and the assisted reproductive technology bills, where women are simply expected to donate their gametes and to bear babies for close relatives without any compensation. And we need to push back against these demands on our altruism. And this has to be done through struggles for recognition, pay, and dignity. Because it is only when you put a price on unpaid work will its value be recognized. And I want to again reinforce that this requires a coordinated front of paid and unpaid domestic and care workers alike. We want better wages for domestic workers, teachers, health workers, ashas, Anganwadi workers, nurses, home-based workers, and indeed women who do any form of unpaid domestic care and economic work at home. So therefore, it is time for an Indian Care Manifesto. So I want to end with the law because Indian courts have produced what I think qualifies as a robust wages for housework jurisprudence. Since the 1980s, Indian courts have compensated dependents of housewives, men and children, when these women died in road accidents. And courts recognize unpaid domestic and care work as being on par with an occupation. So in the January 2021 case of Kirti versus Oriental Insurance Company Limited, Justice N.V. Ramana of the Indian Supreme Court opined that, and I quote here, taking into account the gendered nature of housework, the fixing of notional income of a homemaker attains special significance. It becomes a recognition of the work, labor, and sacrifices of homemakers and a reflection of changing attitudes. It is also in furtherance of our nation's international obligations and our constitutional vision of social equality and ensuring dignity to all. So I simply want to argue that if the law can recognize unpaid work upon death, why not when women are alive? Now, the ILO reported in 2018 that between 1997 and 2012, the gender gap in time spent on unpaid care declined by only 7 minutes. So the ILO estimated that at this rate, it would take 210 years to bridge the gap. Should women wait until then? Absolutely not. I think there is simply no good reason for objecting to putting money in the hands of women. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha. That was a really excellent, very clear position for those who want to agree as well as those who might want to disagree. I think we have two very strong presentations. Selma, in terms of a very wonderful broad sweep of what the women's movement has been demanding for a very, very long time, and which has been revived now in multiple ways. And Prabha bringing in a very strong case of how it would increase, answers the question who would provide it by arguing for state-funded unconditional cash transfers to women, that it would increase her bargaining power both within marriage and with a natal home should the marriage break down, and provide other forms of support. She argues across ages and classes. There are contentious issues in both. The two issues that I saw which could be contentious is Selma's arguing on something which is arguing on women's altruism, of her being the caregiver to nature without the resources, as we know. So we can come back to that. Women own no resources, so why should they be the ones responsible for caring on resources? And Prabha says the demand on our altruism should end. The contentious issue, Prabha, in yours could be the idea that there's a common struggle with domestic workers, you know, and there are serious questions of class and social difference. So I'm just providing little pointers on what came to mind. Especially the question of class, and why you would want to combine the struggle. What are the benefits, if any, rather than distractions of the two, and possibly disempowering domestic workers. In any case, so let us now, these I see as the two in support of part of the debate, and then I request now it's Soumya Kapoor Mehta, who's an economist. And Soumya, you've written on this as well. So look forward to your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veena-ji. And I just wanted to say that I've just been looking at the attendee list. We have so many luminaries amongst us, and it'll be really interesting to actually have more of a broad-based discussion. Here's a time that we can actually come up with some sort of a policy ask from the government, given the attendee lists that we have some excellent speakers and activists in their own right. I'm just going to start.
Don't forget, Soumya, that we are all strong-willed and we might actually disagree.
Yeah, which is good. I'm going to start by saying I'm not sure I completely disagree with Selma and Prabha, but I have disagreements in the manner in which the ask is being made. And I'll just start by saying that this is very important. The debate is extremely important, as we know, for India, because in India, of course, the unpaid care work burden is much more than in other countries. It's 10 times more. So the gap is much more than what we are talking about of an average woman in UK and the US. The technology options that Veena-ji also suggested, which reduce drudgery for a large proportion of Indian population, for women, they don't exist. A market for those sort of services, so for example, if I'm a mother and I'm living in an urban area, I'm educated and earning a living, then I can perhaps get a nanny for my child, I can afford a cook. But otherwise, there's not as much market for domestic work activities to notionally also support it. So I think in India, these debates and of course the social norms are also extremely tied up to the manner in which women provide these services in India. I think more so in the southern context than perhaps, at least in an Indian context, tied up very well with also caste and religion. I think that makes it much more complex. So to start off with, I just want to say that in principle, of course, the idea of providing wages is a good one for two reasons. One, because it associates, it gives a value to the work that is being done rather than the role that is being performed by women. It actually shows that the unpaid duties that a woman performs within the household is actually work. It's also productive work. I mean, there are debates on what gets classified within the productive boundary versus the unproductive boundary. But at the same time, it is work. And the moment you start associating a payment for it or a notional wage also for it, I think that makes it a much more empowering idea. So I think to that extent, the debate is very relevant. It also is very relevant because the moment you start assigning payment to the work that women have been doing, you somehow, of course, and I'll come to the debates and how you measure that. I think that to me is the problematic idea. You also start actually acknowledging the opportunity cost of foregone options. The moment a woman is actually performing these roles within the household, particularly at a time when she is in her productive age and should be in the labor force, she is making compromises either in terms of leaving the labor force completely or choosing flexible options in the informal economy, which might not give her as much compensation for her time. So there are already significant costs that she's bearing in lieu of the work that she's performing at home. There's also a hit to the future dividend because oftentimes women, particularly in India where you have larger joint families, are passing on this work to adolescent girls, which means that quite a few girls then end up, in the absence of secondary schooling, which is now improved in India. But if the access is poor, then you end up taking care of your younger siblings. So there is a significant cost associated with that. So for that fact and for the fact that it should be acknowledged as work rather than any social role that they are mandated to perform, I think it's time that you start acknowledging that there be some notional value associated with it. The problems that I have with the debate is, one is it tends to take away from the other larger construct of the state providing them with equal opportunity and equal wages. The moment you start saying that there is a compensation that's there, the demand side of the labor market and the state actually strengthening options which would be suitable for women starts getting, because if the state has to provide for both, then in a way, it might absolve itself of its responsibility to say that, look, I'm providing you for the compensation for the work that you're doing. Now don't ask me to provide you with opportunities in the labor market which would be suitable for you, and also equal wages. I think the other is really in terms of how do you assign a notional value, and I think this is something that I don't know the legal side of how it's expressed, but I read Justice Ramana's judgment, and I think he also says that it will vary from context to context on how you assign this notional value. So as an economist, do I assign an imputed cost to the time that this woman is actually spending in raising her children, or in fetching water, or in fetching firewood? In which case, how do I break down the smaller processes of labor It's not just actually going, and fetching water, but I might have to actually think through, plan through, or actually, not just the travel time, but also, have to think of, what vessel to get, etc. So there are smaller laborious processes associated with it. How do I add them up in terms of the time spent and then derive an imputed cost? How do I derive a cost, of course, which has been a significant criticism of the wages for house movement, is how do I assign a cost to emotional labor, and how do I assign a cost, how do I value the opportunity cost of time, depending on what the woman wants to do. Does she want to actually spend time in terms of a leisure activity, or is it the opportunity cost is really a very high value job that she might have got in lieu of doing this work, instead of doing this work? And we had a fascinating discussion with Jimol Ben and Professor Hirway and others yesterday. And I think in India, after a long time, we've had a time use survey to start actually valuing those activities. So at least there is some measurement that might be available. But at the same time, as people who've been studying time use surveys in India say that it's extremely hard the ideal is to do a time use survey with the labor force participation survey. It's extremely hard to have an enumerator field it. It will take hours for the woman to fill in. Can we do it, on a longer term basis? Can we do it more frequently? Are the enumerators trained enough? And is the woman also thinking through, what is productive, what is not productive? Because sometimes activities overlap. I'm actually looking after, as I wrote in the article, I'm curing my fish. I'm simultaneously looking after my child. So there's not a strict division of labor in terms of the activity buckets. So I would say, of course, the final set of argument is that it would institutionalize some patriarchal constructs, because the moment you start giving wages to women, then you, in a way, say that particularly if it comes from the husband, is it really then whether the husband owns her services? I think in terms of, so I would just end by saying that to me, I think the idea of assigning a notional value definitely holds a lot of merit. And I think that is, unless, I did not read it correctly, is what the judgments also allude to, that you must have a notional value because you must recognize, the roles that are being performed by women as actual work. Whether or not the state has to pay it is something that is still up for debate, for me at least, against the wider sort of role that the state should be playing for women, which is providing them with the childcare infrastructure, ensuring the maternity, the entitlements under the Maternity Benefits Act are met, providing them with infrastructure that reduces their drudgery, and also investing much more in labor data systems so that this work gets captured. So I'll just end there.
Thank you very much, Soumya. So we have a number of points which I hope Selma, we'll come back to Selma and Prabha. I did want to mention on one of the points that you raised, Soumya, you talked about institutionalizing, in some way, institutionalizing the patriarchal construct. And Selma had said that when they first talked about it, they were told it would institutionalize women. And if I understood her answer right, she said, we don't agree. We are already institutionalized as poor, unpaid, and in the service of men. So how much more can you institutionalize us by this demand for wages for housework? Yeah. So I thought that would be an interesting counterpoint. Ritu, now to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and a very exciting, I think, 3 days which we have had. A lot to discuss, lot to debate, and lot to question in many ways, and lot to add on, of course. For me, the starting point of the entire issue is, things we've been discussing, the simultaneity of women's work, multiplicity, synchronity, etc., etc. But for me, it's the issue of, a gendered work continuum, which is there. So where does really paid work start? Where does it end? Where does unpaid work start? What category of unpaid work? I mean, what is housework in some, could be domestic work in some other categories, or what is called, what I call macroeconomic burden, which the women really bear, keeping in mind the issues of, women's role in consumption, distribution, etc., etc. And linked to this is the issue in which maybe I think we can extend debate on that, is the issue of underpaid work. The issue of non-recognition of women as workers has already come into debate. We know that. I mean, we've been discussing it, whether it's farmers or, women in family enterprises, Asha, Anganwadi, and now the new labor code on wages, which redefines the definition of worker, as well as workplace. And a new category of work, which I have noticed in my studies over the last 5 or 6 years, in the context of paid, unpaid work, which books which I've written, also in the context of demonetization, and very much so, of course, in the context of the pandemic. And here for me, I'm not saying pandemic is pandemic, but the policy response to the pandemic, which has just not taken gender issues, women's issues into account at all. And that is an emergence of part-time work, or what I call half work, which is there. So, women take up 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of work and do their domestic chores or the other kind of, water, firewood, etc. collection for the rest of the time. Now, for me, the economy, if we take it in a broad categorization of paid and unpaid, at a very broad conceptual level, it's very clear that the society, the economy, is manifested or consists of 2 sub-economies. So you have your paid work economy, whatever definition of paid work, and your unpaid work economy, which is there, which also includes men. It's not as if it's only women, because the results which I've got is that at least 20% of men do contribute 20% of the time, and on an average, to unpaid care work, if we say within the household, and also the contribution, which I think we must get into the debate, it is of single migrant men and the kind of housework which they are also doing. So you have these 2 paid, unpaid, broad categorization of economies, and you can enter one at the cost of the other. So it becomes either or, and it becomes also fluidity between the two. You're moving in and out at various levels, several times in the day, probably, if not over occupations, etc. And therefore becomes, as we all know, one of the major constraints to increase in the work participation rate. In fact, it's a major reason for the decline in the work participation rate. Now, we've talked, of course, historically of socialization of housework, etc. And I think maybe what we're doing now is an economization of housework, or an economic calculation. But I think our fundamentals also, which are there very much before us, that housework, unpaid work, etc., is really a macro concept. It's a product of a patriarchal state, which is increasingly withdrawing whatever welfare components. So we don't have discussions on development these days, particularly in India. We only have discussions on growth. And within this, the neoliberal paradigm, the austerity measures, the reduction in allocations on social security, and all kind of development funding, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, and very much so even post the pandemic period. So for me, the resolution of the issue of redistribution of work begins at the macro level. It is not an issue only and of the intra-household distribution and resolution of the problem, because then it really makes it an issue of behavioral economics, and you're dealing with it at a micro level. But what's happening at the national macro level is something which is which goes against the very concept of redistribution of unpaid labor. And therefore you have in India, I'm talking about in India very specifically, is that during this pandemic of the last year, we all know, and there's enough, I think at least, a lot of data, official, unofficial data, that women's unpaid work has increased very dramatically. But it is precisely during this period of time, in June, in August, in September, that your Ujjwala scheme, that is your cooking energy subsidy scheme, was withdrawn. The DBTK was withdrawn, that is your direct benefit transfer of kerosene, which was withdrawn. Gas subsidies were withdrawn. And now even a reduction in the percentage of households which come under the National Food Security Act. So this kind of a macroeconomic burden, which of course falls on both on men and women, but very, very much more, as we know, on women. So therefore, when we discuss this issue, we also need to see it at several interlinked contexts. What is the level of development which has been attained across nations, across regions, across classes? What has been the impact of climate change or environmental degradation, reduction of access in CPRs, on unpaid labor? What is the extent of inequalities? And we know that even things like income inequality and wealth and resource inequalities have increased hugely in the past few years. Therefore, also linked to this is the fact, and which we all recognize, that women are not a homogeneous category. So your income and your class differences come. And therefore, what we demand is, can there be a uniform kind of a demand which cuts through all classes and all categories? Because there are differential accesses to labor and care-saving devices and also facilities. So therefore, can you afford a domestic worker? Can you afford a home tutor, a cook, a home nurse, access to a private creche, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, all these kinds of issues which have an impact on the level of unpaid labor. And unpaid labor, unpaid work, whichever we may define it. And therefore, you see in very interesting kinds of ways that women are dealing with it. I'm not saying this is a solution, but this is a form of, I think, informal, I don't like to use the word social capital, but an informal alternative, which has developed over time. So a woman, when she has to stand in queue for hours to collect water, and this is something I found in my studies, is that she will collect it one day and a neighbor, another woman, will collect it another day. So they take alternate days of collecting water and going to work. So it's like a sharing of responsibility, but at the cost of any kind of a income earning or access to paid economy. Also, lack of creches. We know the allocations are horrendous where creches are concerned. So therefore, you have an emerging trend. I'm not saying it's a dominant trend, but these are issues also which we need to take into account. And that is a working woman, say, and particularly a single working woman, extremely essential. She cannot access a creche, non-available, affordable, at a distance. The timings of the creches don't suit her paid and unpaid work timings, which are there. So therefore, she leaves her children with a neighbor, who's either non-working or old or physically challenged and cannot go to work. So this kind of a, the statement which you hear from women very often amongst the poorer groups. And that is because this is one of the very strange results, I thought, which was there in my studies. And that is a very little amount of care work for children which women spend amongst the very poor categories. And the reply is very simple. They said, "Hamare bacche to bas sadko pe bade ho jate." They just grow up in the gullies. There's no issue of supervision because you cannot afford the time for supervision. So therefore, when we calculate time use, what is paid, what is unpaid, etc., even in our time use studies, many of us who've used them have come across, the same time can have a totally different opposite kind of a connotation. So say time in boiling water, time spent in boiling water. One woman says 0, another woman also says 0. But the basis of saying 0 is very different. She spends no time either because the water is so clean that she doesn't need to boil it, or another woman says she doesn't spend any time on boiling water because she doesn't have the firewood to light that water to be able to drink it. And within this, maybe it can come up in discussion, but there has been, and it's normalized, it's actualized, it's internalized, it's accepted, and that is the issue of linking up sexual favors for attaining employment. This is very much in the context of declining employment rates. Also, in my study on demonetization, I found this, that now giving sexual favors to your contractor is part of your deal. So how do we define this half an hour which is spent? Is it paid work? Is it unpaid work? Is it underpaid work? Is it visible? Is it invisible? And I think these are certain contexts which we really have to get into, including the issue of, whether the family where the woman is working, is it a nuclear family or a joint family? So therefore, what is the family size? Are there other women in the family to help? What is the dependency ratio? Is there child labor? What about those who are physically challenged and need that kind of support? And very much so, because this has come up early again and again, that wages of housework in the context of marriage. But what about the number of women who are outside, number of women and other genders who are outside this patriarchal definition of what is supposed to be a marriage? Your female-headed households, child-headed households, deserted women, bigamy, I mean, second wives is a huge issue in 2-3 communities in India. Unmarried women. Should an unmarried woman not get any representation in the housework which she has to do because of your macroeconomic a blindness to the care work of women? And of course, same-sex unions. I mean, it's not even allowed in India, but in many other countries. Do we not take that into account also where this is concerned? So for me, at a broader level, it's a fascinating issue. It needs to be debated. It needs to be discussed. And where the legal aspect is concerned, I don't know why we need to make a differentiation. I don't know. I mean, we have a legal expert there. But whatever is the compensation for a man, it should be exactly the same for a woman. Maybe I'm putting it very simply, whether she's working or not working. But we have Justice Prabha with us who will delve into this in greater detail. Several more things, but maybe we'll come into that where the debate is concerned. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ritu. You raised many, many issues, but two in particular, the questions of intersectionality, of class, and so on, were very central. And the question of the macroeconomy. I think I might just say that this is not just a behavioral issue that we are discussing.
Exactly.
Because no, but nor is anybody arguing that. So it is for economists to. No, yeah. May I just? Sure. It is for economists to actually recognize that relieving women of housework will actually make a huge difference to the functioning of the macroeconomy and to the polity. As well, when women are pradhans, for instance, that they invest more in public goods. There's that literature and the other literature. So I just wanted to bring that back, that it's not wages for housework versus let's look at the macroeconomy, but in fact, one could lead to the other. So you're not saying that. Okay, so now we have with us another very special guest and speaker, Justice Prabha Sridharan, but I'll just call her Sridevan. I won't call her Prabha because there are two Prabhas. Justice Sridevan, you, among other hats, you actually passed a really landmark judgment. It came onto your table, you said, in which you discussed the issue of housework under the Motor Vehicles Act case. So please give us your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have learned a lot from my earlier speakers and from the chair, of course. Just before this session started, we were discussing, and I was feeling a little depressed about the condition of women 2 days before International Women's Day. And our chairman, Beena, said that why should you look at the journey your case has traveled? True. It was 2009, April. And I didn't dream that it would be the subject matter, the case would go up to the Supreme Court and it would be confirmed. But I must confess that when the judgment was written, I did not look at it from all angles. And recently, when the Supreme Court, the judgment Kirti case that Prabha mentioned, was reported in a journal, the picture that accompanied the case was a woman standing in front of a stove which had a chimney, one of those electronic chimney with a sink and all that. And I thought, how many sisters of mine in India have that luxury? So it is a very difficult question to answer because we are not just single faceted. There are too many angles, and many of the questions that each one of you raised, I'm in accordance with quite a few. I think that women's, and I'm not saying wife, I'm saying the work that woman does, it should be recognized economically. And I'm sure you have also heard it, whenever there is a question about personal laws, it is always about divorce. I think we should think of inheritance. I think there lies the strengthening of women. Once it is the family and the society understand that the woman of the family has as much a right to a share in the property, maybe things will change slowly. It will change, it will take time. And the sentence, all of us are caring for all of us, which Selma said was so inspiring. Actually, there were so many sentences that you all said that I noted down, but I cannot repeat all of them now. And as for the state taking responsibility, just now you heard Ritu talking about the withdrawal of the Ujjwala scheme. When the state says that it will pay and draws up a scheme, it can also withdraw. So that is a very dicey ground that we stand on. And the other disappointment that I have felt is the judgment that was given in minor Deepika's case has been echoed only in motor accident cases. I don't know why. In fact, even in the judgment, we said this can be extrapolated for a sharing of matrimonial property. Until now, I don't think I have heard of even one judgment where that has been applied so that the woman's share in the property can be determined by valuing the work she has done, be it as a mother or a sister, it doesn't matter. I mean, brothers have to share property with the sisters too. So even there, when the property is shared, how does one share it? How does one value it? And it is a great idea, but 10 years of being a judge brings to my mind all the questions that people, the lawyers who want to attack it will raise. But today I don't want to raise all those questions. I want to leave it on a positive note. I hope the recognition of the value of the work that women do, which is not recognized, which has not been paid for, gains a form and a tangible structure that women are able to make a claim and successfully receive it. I mean, just standing in the queue with a board of a scheme written there is not enough. We know only women stand in those long lines. It must be real and they must receive it. And I'm very happy that I was invited, and I'm very grateful to iWage and all of you, because I'm really a last minute trespasser, but I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. This is an important matter to be discussed, and from different views. I think we should think out of the box. We cannot think along the usual lines. Each one of us has to think of, if you have thought as an economist, think for some time as a human rights activist. And then you will get all the angle to any question. And if I have thought of situations as a human rights person, I must now look at it as an economist. What is the burden that it will put on the exchequer? Is it something that is doable? So if we discuss all that and crystallize it in one form, I'll be very grateful. My best wishes, and I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for those insights and also all the background, the invisible work you've done in the courts on behalf of all of us. So there was this slogan which was charted in the 1990s. I think Charlotte Bunch and others had said that women's rights are human rights. So I think many of us approach this not as lawyers or economists, but really in relation to human rights. I would say that. From what I can see, in terms of your side of the debate, you are overall in support of the wages for housework. So, so I think what I will do now is that if any of the panelists have any responses, let me, if you could do that briefly on any specific point rather than point by point. You have to go.
I just say, no. I'll go quietly. I won't disturb you.
Yes, please go ahead.
The principle I agree, but the form I am not sure. The form it has to take. The economic value part I agree, but the form.
That's right.
I can see the pitfalls there and the uncertainty.
Excuse me. Actually, you did say that you brought in the issue of property, the community of property question, which we've discussed. Prabha has also raised it, and I had raised it yesterday. So you're quite right. I think the form, the value given, the amount who it should go to are all questions which have come up today, rather than any very serious disagreement on the need for a recognition and some form of compensation, although Soumya may have other views on this. So I had a few comments of my own, but did any of you other panelists want to take up a specific point that was raised? Or shall I give you my broad comments and then you could respond to that? And we need to also then open up to the floor. There've been some wonderful questions. So shall I do that? What do the panelists say? Shall I just say a few things on my own and then we just open it up because time is also moving along. So I wanted to pick up a very few things. One was the point that I've made earlier as well, that care work is done. Most Indian households are not one person or man and a person and their partner, be it same sex or other sex partner households. Most households have at least typically have two women, a woman and a daughter, but they would also have, sisters-in-law, there would be a mother-in-law. So the extended families, and there are women. So the moment you extend the family, on the one hand, you expand the housework because there are more members, but you also have more to share. And so when we talk about wages for housework or any kind of economic compensation, this question remains that it cannot be just one-time transfer to one person. How do we then think about recognizing that it is shared? Housework is shared, and therefore any kind of compensation also needs to be shared. And now this is one aspect, and this becomes equally complicated when we talk about things like the community of property and matrimonial property as a mechanism of recognizing women's contribution to housework. Of course, one point is it is only recognized at the time of divorce, and that's not where you want the woman to be empowered alone. You also want her to be empowered while she's in the marriage. So the community of property can't substitute for the possibility that you have a support for wages for or some sort of compensation for housework. But in relation to matrimonial property, again, since Justice Sridevan had also raised it, that I think we tend to forget that when you increase the share of of the wife, you automatically decrease the shares of other women in the household. So if you say that the man's property should be shared half with the wife who will be divorced, then what about the rights of the first order heirs, the mother of the man and the daughter as well, and the son? So, I think that would be seen as quite unfair, even within a feminist framing of it. That how would you justify one woman's claims over other women's claims? Some women who, from childhood, daughters from the age of 7 start contributing to household work, and the marriage may last even just 2 years or 3 years. So I don't think this is an easy ride. One possibility is that if you talk about community of property sharing at the time of divorce, you could say, well, let's deduct the shares of the first order heirs, and then the man shares what is left with his wife. I mean, but it can't be put under the carpet. I don't think we've really discussed this. I've written about it in earlier context, but I think this needs to be explicitly discussed. The second is that could we as economists talk about the value of housework, and with all the complexity that Soumya brought to it, in variety of ways as an accounting measure? But that doesn't necessarily need to be all the inputs needed for us to actually discuss what compensation women should get, because clearly it's untenable. You can't discuss household by household how much. You can't value every element of whether you do cooking or whether you do cleaning and so on, and then market value it. So could we think of it in 2 different ways, a valuing for national income accounts and so on, and then separately some kind of assessment if you actually want to think of an income transfer? The third was, and very quickly, is that this is a process. So when we think that we are stereotyping women, it's not that this is the end all. Just as empowerment is a process, today, if you empower women by some kind of say unconditional transfer compensation, it could empower her, and her daughter would be in a very different position in the next generation. So it doesn't be all and end all there. Things change over time, and perceptions can change. So I think this could be seen as an important first step in that direction. The fourth is that I think Ritu talked about it, about sharing of the burden of care. But I would say that, you share in many ways, and I've been talking about the sharing of resources and not just the burden of care. So you can share property. Our solutions do need to be much more group-based, and I think whether it's land or housing or other forms of ways by which women would have an exit option, if you like, from violent marriages and so on. So I won't dwell too much on it. Maybe many of you already know these arguments. The one point, I suppose, where I feel that we need to not look at women's care work and then link it to care of nature, because there's been the ecofeminist argument where, including an Indian version of it, the idea that women should care for nature simply because they happen to be more dependent on firewood and fodder and forests, without giving them resources. This was something which Maurice Storm talked about in 1992 at the Rio conference. And I think this link we need to, in my view, we need to unlink. There's no reason why women should be responsible for saving the planet, which some might argue men have polluted. Let them clean up the mess. And give women the resources needed to go green. So in any case, let me end my brief comments on that. I think I've made it, it's fairly transparent on which sides of the debate I'm on, but I think in what way the compensation should go still remains on the table. So if it's okay with the panelists, there've been a lot of very interesting comments and debates. So what I will do is I can see some of them. So I can either read it out, or I can ask them to be very brief, so that we have more of a sense of people speaking. So I've seen Indu, I've seen your hand as well. Pamela Philippus, Pam, you had mentioned, did you want to briefly say a word? And perhaps Soumya, you could unmute her if she's still there. So Pam.
I can't unmute herself now.
Yeah, okay. Is Pam, have you unmuted Pam? Is she still there? No.
She's still there, but I think she's unable to unmute herself. I've given her the rights to do that.
So Pam, you just need to click on where you've got the rights of unmuting yourself. Okay, I will. She says, such a privilege to listen to Selma Jones, such an inspiration. And she particularly has a question about climate change, that women spend a lot of time strenuous fetching water, firewood, fodder, and so on. And how do we work for international and national acknowledgement of this ever-expanding burden? And I'll read out 2 or 3, and then people could take it. Amrita Shodhan has mentioned, have you thought of a universal minimum income? Yes. Then I would like to, let me take 2 or 3, and then Indira has a rather long comment, so maybe Indira Hirve, would you like to just take that up on the universal basic income, which I presume is gender neutral? Prabha or anybody else?
Yes, I would like to speak on
Selma,
that.
yes, please. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think everybody should have a universal basic income. And I think all carers should have an income on top of that, because the basic income is for everybody. And it's right that people should have money so that nobody has to starve to death, which is a threat in most parts of the world to some people and sometimes many people. But I think I think the fact that there must be a care income. Now, I want to say why income rather than even wages. Many people want it to be called wages, but many of us think it should be income, because the question that was raised by one woman, that you cannot pay for this work, the emotional work and all the work. The work is a relationship. You cannot pay for a relationship. What you can do is enable the relationship to happen in the best possible circumstances. And for that, those who do caring are entitled to an income to be able to do that caring. That's women and that's men. We don't see any reason why men should not be carers, but first they must be relieved of some of the work they are now doing, which helps to pollute the world. And many people, women and men, would like to care for the environment, urge that we care for the environment, are ready to sacrifice themselves or at least put their lives into that, but they cannot because they haven't got an income to do it with. So the universal basic income, yes, and but the care income on top for all who care, whatever gender, whatever situation, whatever country in the world, rural as well as urban. And that income must come in the form that is appropriate. That is, some people will want the cash, but some people will want the land. People refer to this, that's absolutely right. Women work the land that they may not own and may have no chance of owning, but because they are caring for the land and because they are caring for people, they are entitled to own that land. And that land is the recognition of the fact that they care for the urban environment and for the rural environment and for the people within it. So may I take this chance to say something else?
Yes, of course.
An income of what we are describing for work which is life enhancing and life assuring, which we want men to join us with, and they will get paid as well. That income, we fight for it in our communities. We fight for it in the rural area. We fight for it in the urban environment, but we fight for it also in the work that we do outside the home. First of all, the fact that we have an income enhances our struggle for pay equity. But conversely, the work we do outside the home is a place where we fight for time for care, and women and men are doing this in the waged workplace in a number of places. In fact, in places where I have worked, the women got a day off paid. The women workers got a day off paid around Christmas because Christmas is so much work for women in the West. Whether they're Christian or not. And so what the women had won is a paid day off from their waged work. Now that's really a symbol, a symptom of what is possible when you have the power of the waged workplace. You use it to relieve yourself of unwaged work, or at least for payment for unwaged work, and vice versa. The fact that you have an income is a tremendous power to fight for employers to pay you or to be able to refuse that job or that profession or that aspect of work they're ready to pay you a pittance for, and you can say, no way. You know, that's the power of women.
Thank you, Shelma. So that strengthens the case of that it would increase your bargaining power, not just within the home, but also with employers, with outside it. And there is actually a supportive comment by Liz Hilton, who says that if you're a single mother, you're also doing caring. Having a wage would allow us to decide and manage how we manage the caring work we do. And one could add, including, buying equipment, which in groups, for instance. So Ivy would like to answer. Yes, please go ahead, Soumya, please do. And all of you could read these questions as well, and then pick them up.
I think there was an interesting point in the question and answers whether, of course, do we want to combine hands with the universal basic income debate. Having worked a little bit on the UBI pilot in India, I can say that I think we should keep it separate, because I think the point that Selma's making is a very relevant one, that you should have a care income for all. Now, of course, whether it takes an unconditional cash transfer, I think Justice Sridevan made a very relevant point, which is, in principle, I think it's good. What form it takes is something, and whether you want the state to pay, because then the state, and there was a related question for me that, once you ask the state to pay, are we absolving the state of its other responsibilities for equal opportunity and equal wages? I would say no, of course, both can go on in parallel. But having worked with bureaucrats, they also tend to see it in compartments. And you say that, if I'm doing this, for a lot of the women who are actually supposedly out of the workforce, then a lot of my burden has been taken care of. Unfortunately, that might be the case the moment we actually start putting budgets behind it or a scheme behind it. So there is a danger there. There was one related question, which is the final question on work from home and whether that actually increases women's bargaining power. From whatever studies I've seen during the pandemic, actually it has reduced women's bargaining power. It has also been, with women managing multiple burdens, particularly now being at home and doing everything simultaneously. And actually women losing many more jobs because, they are not able to leave their homes even when the lockdowns have been lifted, because they have to take care of the elderly, they have to take care of their children because the schools are closed. And therefore they have been the ones who have been losing jobs. So I don't know whether work from home in the longer run would be able to increase women's bargaining power.
Soumya, I don't think people were arguing that that working from home per se would increase bargaining power, but it was the question of whether the transfer of income would increase bargaining power. What I know of flexi work time, and this is not about the pandemic and middle-class housewives staying at home, but on flexi work time, which has been introduced in Australia, in the US. Then both spouses are able to work from home and do more sharing of care work. At least some of the initial studies seem to suggest that. So I think the context in which this was being talked about is different. And you're right. I mean that that the context perhaps needs to be defined, because in the context you describe, of course, it wouldn't be the case. So Ritu, did you want to take this and any other? Because there are other questions as well. May I request people to please ask short questions and then send long comments, because we won't be able to cover that.
Okay, so just, just 2 or 3 points. One, I just want to clarify, because that question has come in different kinds of ways. That you see the concept of housework or unpaid work, etc., directly linked to it's not macro versus micro, but certainly where the major responsibility rests is with the state. So if the entire size of unpaid work, unpaid care work in particular, is reduced, then at the household level, there is much less to redistribute. So the focus comes from there, and the redistribution component. That's why I don't think this intra-family kind of a thing is of course a part of the campaign, but it cannot be the major. The major focus has to be, it's like uniform, the universal basic income, which we are talking about. It's not at the cost of the welfare schemes or of a welfare state of public provisioning. It's along with it. Yeah. So that is one point. Second, 2 more points. One, I think Mary has raised something about Mary. I think there's a little misunderstanding, because what I'm saying is, let's get out of this marriage definition of a family and go beyond the marriage, and therefore those who are single, those who are deserted, children, same sex, different genders, etc., that what we say has to also incorporate them very much so. And the third point I just want to make here is, when we say legally redistribution of property, etc., 90% of Indians don't have any property to distribute. They don't have houses. They don't have anything to distribute. So if we can get out of this property ownership into those who are absolutely no assets and no property, how then do we deal with this situation? Okay, so that's what I wanted to say now.
Yeah. I think, Ritu, I mean, I'm a chair, but I just thought I'd also just intervene here. I think there are many things that you need to make women's lives better. But it seems to me that we can't, since we're discussing this particular element, are you saying that there's a trade-off between this and something else? Because I don't think the argument is that you shouldn't ask for more demand for women's work, or having, enabling circumstances where women can go to work when they want work, closer to home, safer, and so on. But not all demands can be pitched around this particular discussion. The other is that I don't agree that 90% of India has no property. That's just not the case. That's not the case with land. In rural India, they have very small amounts, but people do have. And there is an answer to that, which is that even if you own very little, you could pool it together in groups. I mean, Kudumshri is a very good example that you could have group farming and pool your small resources to make for a bigger production, more productive production unit. I think it has to be a much more complex debate. You're right, but the wages for housework or salaries for housework is not about not giving to everybody. I think the means test is there.
Talking about at the broader level. Fine.
Yeah. So I think we need to focus specifically on what is on debate today. Now there are so many comments and questions. They're very. I would just suggest that Archana and also. Indrani had their hands up. So Indu, you had said, I would still go with the right to work for all and social security for all, men and women. So I've just read that out. Archana, because she's got her hand up, would you like to ask a question? I know you're not in, I don't know where you fall in the queue, but I would suggest people could please put their hand up because it's you've got like very long comments and it's quite difficult to actually convert them into questions. So Archana and then Shivani, please unmute yourself.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
I am too happy to hear Salma Jones. I never have imagined कि मैं कभी सलमा जोन्स को सुन पाऊंगी, तो मैं बहुत खुश हूँ कि आज मैं सलमा जोन्स को सुन पाई. और
मैं ट्रांसलेट करती हूँ, एक मिनट. Selma, she thinks it's an opportunity of a lifetime to have heard you.
So when I got admission in MA Women Studies in Wardha, so Elena ma'am was there. So I remember all मतलब those days जब मैं
सवाल पूछे. हाँ
जी. So मैम मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि actually land, actually property, family, economy actually are related to patrilineal and patrilocal forms. Okay, तो so अगर family का patrilineal है, so तो women का जो पूरा life है वो उस पूरे patriarchal और patrilineal structure में inbuilt है. तो ये current form of economy जैसे हम कहते हैं कि कैपिटलिस्ट इकोनॉमी है, तो जब आप फैमिली, लेबर और मनी तीनों डिफरेंट एंड अलग अलग हो जाता है, तो ऐसे कंडीशन में फिर हम ऐसा लगता है कि हम एक चीज को पकड़ रहे हैं तो दूसरी चीज छूट रही है. तो जबकि ट्रेडिशनल या फ्यूडल मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन जो है वो पूरा ही इंटाइटल्ड है, पूरा लाइफ इंटाइटल्ड है. लेकिन इन दिस पर्टिकुलर कैपिटलिस्ट इकोनॉमी या बियॉन्ड फ्यूडल इकोनॉमी जब हम देखते हैं तो कहीं ना कहीं एक फ्रेगमेंटेड वे में फैमिली, लेबर और विमेन इन तीनों ही कहीं ना कहीं अलग अलग लोकेशन पे हो जाते हैं.
आपका सवाल, हाँ, तो सवाल कुछ स्पेसिफिक सवाल है क्या?
जी, तो मैं यही बोल रही हूँ कि जब हाउस होल्ड वेज की बात हम करते हैं, एक्चुअली हाउस होल्ड वेज लेबर एक पैट्रियार्कल पूरे स्ट्रक्चर में है, पैट्रियार्कल पूरे फैमिली स्ट्रक्चर में है. तो अगर हम लेबर को पैट्रियार्कल स्ट्रक्चर्स के बियॉन्ड देख रहे हैं, तो क्योंकि स्टेट ऑलरेडी
तो आप ये कह रही हैं कि इसका कोई सुझाव नहीं है until you dismantle the but these are hello.
नहीं मैम,
अच्छा, तो I don't want, actually there's so many people waiting, तो अगर कोई
या मैं बोलूं एक्चुअली फॉर्म ऑफ पैट्रिलिनियल जो स्ट्रक्चर है हमें उसको भी कंसीडर करने की जरूरत है.
Okay, so I'll take that as a comment to all the panelists. Is that okay? And then thank you. Shivani Patel, and then Rituraj Sharma.
What did she say?
Shalma, it's very difficult to translate this, but it's she says there's a whole patriarchal structure also linked to the mode of production, be it feudalism or capitalism, and it's linked not just to patriarchy but also patrilineal. So that's the quickest and shortest way I could translate it for you. So that it's much more deeply embedded and can't be dismantled by this measure or that measure is what I got.
Can I say
Hanji, Shalma, no, okay, you want to, okay.
One sentence.
Okay.
Yes, on the question you just, it is very deeply entrenched, but it can be destroyed and cleared away only by a movement, a mass international movement, which we must build. We have no choice but to build it.
Spoken like a true activist. And one can add that we have been doing it. I don't see it as such a pessimistic position we are in now as we were 50 years ago, we might say.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you. Shivani and Rituraj Sharma, and then I'll try and find some questions here as well.
Yes. So
could you be brief, just to be fair to everybody?
Yeah. I'll be very brief. I'll be. So I'm a research scholar, and I'm in my early stage of research, and I'm also looking at care work. So I wanted to ask, what is how we can categorize this word care when it has blurred boundaries, as we discussed already. So I wanted to know how you define care to get the economic institutionalization of it.
Okay, thank you. So we'll keep that for the panelists. Let me then also mention Soumya Uma has asked a question to Prabha that if you get this transfer, what is to guarantee that the husband won't take control over it and that it could become a new ground for domestic violence? So Prabha, if you could keep that under your sheet for the minute. Rituraj Sharma, did you want to ask your question? So we have two questions here.
So my question to the panelists is that by demanding the recognition and wages for housework, so could we really help in letting it perceive as women's work in respectful terms? Because we have already seen in past that how in various attempts, so for example this Delhi metro and buses, various compartments and seats are reserved for women in public to be in public sphere. So these kind of attempts have also registered in negative manner as well. So in the same scenario, attaching monetary aspect as wages for housework, would it really help women in gaining the respect and recognition towards their work, or would it further bound them to the four walls of home, and would then eliminate their potential from the labor force and employment and educational opportunities in future? So I fear that might further deepen up the gender gap and hierarchies in the patriarchal society.
I see. So somebody should keep that. We'll just come. Soumya Uma's two questions I will answer. Prabha can answer, and I would also like to answer. Let me add one more, and then there's Indira's question, which we can take up. Ben Martin, unless you are at the 1%, most men are struggling to make ends meet on 0 hours contract, and low wages are often dangerous jobs. We support a care income to lessen the pressure to earn a wage outside the home. So this is a male point of view which is the pressure to simply earn and be the providers. We know that women do most of the caring, and the $2 trillion spent worldwide on the military should go to women and all carers. So I'll take that as a suggestion and a comment. And then why don't we come back to the questions that have been asked, and then we'll take some more. So Soumya, you wanted to answer a question, the first question raised. Please go ahead.
No, I think for the cash transfer, I think it was for Prabha. I mean...
No, but that's a separate question. You had said that you wanted to answer a question. I haven't actually written them all down, so I had simply told you to put them in your sheet.
No, I think one of the other comments that have come in, which is about whether these debates are mutually exclusive. So assuming, if we just say that we should be paying women for housework, are we actually endangering our cause in another space, which is, fighting for better infrastructure or, a universal childcare policy? Is it necessarily exclusive? And I think that was a very interesting question as well, in terms of, how we go to the policymakers. So I'm just raising that question for all of us.
You're raising the question. I did want to come in on that, which is to say there is no reason to believe that. After all, the issue of water and firewood have been going on for at least 40 years. I was in the 80s a member of the Water Technology Mission. So providing pipe drinking water is part of the SDGs, part of the government's commitment to the citizens. And I think many of the other infrastructure you're talking about, which are general in infrastructure but have gendered components, are independent of this. I don't see that will decline as a result of any compensation in relation to housework. I actually don't see how that would be seen as a trade-off. There could be a trade-off between transferring to women and community of property. I mean, so that's in a separate space. Prabha, did you want to? Did that make sense?
I just wanted to echo that. First of all, when I spoke about the proposal, it was in addition to, not instead of. I just want to underline that, and I think I completely agree with you on the trade-off question. I think if we had these sort of trade-off concerns, we would have never had the Food Security Act. We would have never had NREGA. If you would never have any radical redistributive measures if you feared trade-offs. I think that is a matter of political struggle. And I think the documentation now of how NREGA was passed, how the Food Security Act was passed, show ample evidence that you have to have a multi-sided strategy, both from within the government, from the outside, through the courts. I think that's how they became successful. And of course, the larger political climate. I'll just quickly respond to some of the other questions. Also, I'm not trying to dig into the divide between paid and unpaid workers at all. In fact, I think to the contrary is what I was saying. I was actually saying that whether you're doing unpaid economic work within the home or whether you're doing paid care work outside the home, I think the idea is to have some kind of platform, joint platform through which you can reinforce your right, for your work to be recognized. So the idea is to form coalitions, is not at all to, keep with the divide between paid and unpaid, because as everyone has rightly said, and over the symposium as well, it's actually impossible to disentangle the two of them. And I think very quickly to Samya's question, yes, absolutely. Any number of unintended consequences can follow. There is no guarantee. We know, law reforms in India are, there's a mess of unintended consequences, some of which we could have anticipated, some of which we couldn't have. And I don't think, the prospect of the transfer being withheld and being used as a grounds for domestic violence is a good enough reason not to attempt it. I think you're pointing to, a possible consequence which we should safeguard against, but I don't think that's a reason for not, bringing it up. And I just want to say that the Indian case law on motor vehicles, is an excellent example actually of what might happen if you had wages for housework, because you have a testing ground. You basically have these judges who have now have to acknowledge, because of precedent, that you have to pay, you have to, assign a notional income to the housework. And you find that some judges are extremely misogynistic, not overtly, but by glorifying womanhood. But then there are judges who are, are talking about egalitarian, companionate, marriages with equality in them. So actually, yes, it can. And I think if you are worried about entrenched gender stereotypes, then we should stop having paid domestic work. It's very simple. There are any number of feminized sectors where, the vast majority are women, but we are not telling them we won't pay you. You should stop doing this work. It just simply does not hold. I think, instead we're asking for improved work conditions for them, better rights, better pay. So you have to remember that healthcare, nursing, education, housework, all of that are heavily feminized. So we are not raising this question of gendered stereotypes there. So we just have to be consistent in our argumentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to mention this. This is Soumya Uma, not other Soumya. Is that we would make no progress if every time you think you transfer anything to women, it'll lead to domestic violence. If you actually look at the vast literature on domestic violence, those are not causing domestic violence. If women have property, for instance, I remember when I was talking about property protecting women from domestic violence, and there are people, feminist scholars, who said it'll lead to more women being killed. But in fact, there's no evidence of that. Women are, there are backlashes if women want to marry whoever they want, there are backlashes if they want to go to college. So what does it actually mean? And also it isn't the case that the Hindu Succession Act is not gender equal. It is. I would suggest that you relook at it. But more generally, I think there are a lot of hypotheses that are in these questions. But let's treat these as hypotheses rather than as facts. For instance, the fact that if you transfer something to women, the men will take it away. Well, let's see what the evidence is, because now there's quite a lot of evidence of state transfers to women. In India, in Brazil, in Mexico, in many other countries. The second is, SEVA has one way to actually protect women is if they are put into a savings bank where the woman goes to the group and says, if I want to take the savings out, so that the husband can't pressure her to take the money out. Because you need, it's protected by the group in some sense. I'm sure if, Mirai or Renana were here, they would be able to elaborate on that. So there are protections possible, but also I think that transfers, economic resources transferred to women, protect women or lead them to be in a worse position. You have to look at the evidence, and the evidence suggests that they are more protective than otherwise. Okay, there are other questions here. Nalini, okay, Nalini's comment is much more on the issues of wages would tend to institutionalize the present sexual division of labor and patriarchal control. There's a question by Indira as regards divorce. There should be a flat 50% income should go to the wife. I think the point I made was, what about the other women? Did you want to take up any of these? Can you see these questions? Because they're very long comments. So it's very difficult to then. Shivali Kumar, I agree with Ritu that care has to be recognized and integrated into the macroeconomy. I would need to add that poor Dalit women, like manual scavengers, keep the environment clean, but their work is often not adequately compensated. They're untouchable, they're landless, they have no property. The drudgery of paid work and housework is complicated for them. How do we calculate this aspect of the housework? So IWage said they would like to answer this question. Please go ahead and answer this and any other question that you would like to pick up from here.
No, I think the point was about intersectionality is a very relevant one, and also this, particularly we have class and caste issues, and therefore, some people actually deliberately taking on this work. I just wanted to say that we have a study that's coming up in collaboration with the APU, Asim Premji University, where we are trying to actually just address this exactly how SC women are working and even Muslim women are working vis-a-vis other women. And I'm hoping that that would be able to at least answer some of this question. And we have built in a time use element there as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment, now it's disappeared, by Donna Barnett, who says to respond to those who do not have property to distribute, 3 things are essential. She argues to have the work valued, the issue of time as a resource, which is very important because you can actually go and work if you're paid for the unpaid work, and the collective work and responsibility of a lot of us, which is working communally, contributing together. I think there would be general agreement very much on that. So thank you for that comment. Okay, there's Kari Michelle. The question of the value of women's work is demonstrated when we stop doing it. In 1975, all the women in Iceland went on strike and the entire country ground to a halt. So that would appeal to you, Selma, and among others, that if women stop working, if women stop various other things, how effective that would be. So I take that as a comment. And you know, these are very long comments, so I can't possibly read them out. Yes, Soumya Umar, we can talk about that. There are small inequalities, but I think there's broad equality. There are small elements that can still be reformed. There's Stefania Barca, comment on the care income. WFH is about justice and dignity in the economic realm, dignifying care work by remunerating as work, not a natural feminine activity, means reconstructing the economy entirely around the value of care, which is domestic, community, and ecology. So that is closer to the position, not to the solution, but to the issues that Selma had raised. And I think we would also all agree that the issue of care is much broader than simply care within the home. And I think all of these can be saved, and then there could be more of these answers could be provided individually to the people who've asked these questions. Satyajit Dasgupta, isn't there a need to both quantify and qualify the different normal time and contingent constituents of house, kitchen, and medical care work women do have to take in middle class homes under severe compulsion of physical and mental pressure? What could a politically correct methodology of computation of these variables in terms of certain theoretical considerations be? Rather loosely, alienation of domestic work and fractured domesticity. So would anybody want to take that up? Or, I mean, I would actually pose it to Indira Hirve if she would like to answer that. Indira, would you like to take this up? I'm not sure she's here. Could people please put their hands up and then we could try and wind up? There are a lot of comments which we will save, and I think, okay, Shraddha again. Yes, Shraddha Jain, if you would, yeah, please ask. Go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, thank you for this interesting discussion. I was just wondering, how do we place community or state-provided care provision vis-a-vis compensation for housework? Like, and secondly, does community-provided care provision will reinforce the altruism perception of care? These are my two questions.
Okay, can I just one quickly before we lose it, because they've been Indira's coming in. Indira is saying today the percentage of joint family is 19%, but that's a standard definition of joint family, Indira. It doesn't. If you have a woman and her daughter, it will not be counted in your statistics as joint family, but they will be two women sharing the housework, and they will both be. They both have a claim to the man's property. So that's an answer to the several questions you've been raising, which is to say, let's just give half the property of the man to the, in case of divorce. And also that there are multiple, that a nuclear family would include an unmarried daughter, and she would be doing care work. So I think the general point about several women sharing would remain, don't you think? Okay, so I pass that question by Shraddha to whoever wants to answer it, and I think we will close in 5 minutes. So please go ahead. Anybody, all 5 of you. You didn't get the question? Is that why you're smiling?
Sorry, it was just very broad. And I've also been answering questions in the live chat.
Oh, are you? Okay. All right. Okay. So did you just want to say a word or two, because she's laid out these questions?
Can I just say?
Shelma, go ahead.
Yes, I just merely want to mention an organization in the United States which we should pay close attention to. It's called the Poor People's Campaign, and it is absolutely led by people who really need money. And of course, who is the most people are women, and who is really taking the lead in it is women, and they are demanding a care income. That's part of what they demand, but they want also to deal with the military. They want to deal with racism, and the other thing they want to deal with is the environment.
15.
So they want a $15 minimum wage on the one hand and a care income on the other, dealing with both the waged work and the unwaged work, and mentioning the poverty which they both address. So this is an important movement which is gaining ground all over the US. And it's also connected with new legislation in the US would give women something of an income. It's now on the cards. There's no time to discuss it.
There's a very general question. There's a long comment. Honored to listen to Selma, James, and Justice Sridevan. And so this is about intersectionality. So I will take it as a comment, because the question really is, would like to know how we could relook at production and reproduction and the entire relation to work itself, if all labor could be looked at as caring labor itself. So you're nodding, Selma. Did you have a brief comment on that?
What? She's
asking if you want to comment.
What?
That's by Priyanka. Okay.
You want to comment on that? She just asked you, do you want to comment on that? Looking at all labor.
Yeah, but that is absolutely what we're aiming for. We must look at the economy not as the end, but as the means to what end we want. And we want a planet that's whole and productive for itself. And we want work and activity. The end and aim must be the well-being and happiness of people and of the planet. If we look at work from that point of view, we would come to many conclusions about the work we don't want to do, and many conclusions about what we want the caring work that we do to produce. That is, what kind of people, what kind of relationships, what kind of neighborhoods and communities, what relationship between the rural and the urban, what about the food we eat? It must nourish us rather than make us fat and make us vulnerable to the pandemic. Everything, if we begin that the purpose is the human race and the planet together and life rather than production for production's sake, we would come to very different conclusions and think of ourselves and our relationships differently in a productive and creative way.
So that's a wonderful, thank you, Shelma. That's a wonderful statement. Let me try and now draw this to a close. Also give each of you as panelists a final comment that you might want to make. And there are a lot of comments, some supportive, some raising questions. And I think those, if you want to take up individually later by email, you could do so. And then you can see if you want to add or nuance the arguments you've already made. So we can start with, how about we start with is Justice Sridevan still here? No, she's left. So we'll go backwards. Ritu, did you want to have a closing comment?
Muted. Nothing much to add except to restate that this entire issue has to be seen in a broader context of development, underdevelopment, de-development, and what has been happening is a process of de-equalization of gender in many different kinds of ways, whether it's in the form of unpaid work or increasing care work, less, declining work participation rates, no socialization of any kind of care work, in fact, a reduction of whatever we have. So I think we have to see this entire issue in the broader context of austerity, of reduction in developmental expenditure. So, and where gender just doesn't seem to count, at all. So
would you say that in relation to this debate, you wouldn't spend your time on it? You don't think it's worth your while?
It's not a question of spending time. I think as a campaign, it's interesting. And I think one has to develop some kind of a model or a sort of a plan really to take it forward, and what should the basis be, keeping all the complexities in mind. But for me, it's always to reduce the massive burden at a broad level. And you're talking, we water, energy, of course, but that still continues because the problem hasn't been resolved. And now with a new attack on food security, which has come just about 5 days ago, that's going to be another major issue where women's unpaid care work is concerned because of their role in production and maintenance, and of course, distribution within the family.
Right. Okay. So thank you. Soumya, did you want to have a last comment? Have you moved from your position? Because I think we've had a rich debate. If we are in the same spot as where we started, then we can't resolve it. So it would be nice if you could say where in your arguments you would argue differently if you were to be asked to argue all over again, which I'm not planning to do, of course.
No, I think I was really inspired by Justice Sridevan when she said that, as an economist, you must think also like a human rights activist. I think this space has given me the time to do that, at least personally. And I think, I don't know what we should do, and probably one idea for Prabha is that, I think there should be something that comes out of it as a symposium and both these debates can go on parallelly. Binaji, as you were saying that, of course, we've been arguing for infrastructure. We've all been arguing for childcare provisions. We've all been, that is something that's there, but I think this has made me at least realize that there is, in principle, a value to at least notionally assign something, a cost or, imputation or anything that's now, as an economist, I might say that, of course, I'll use an imputed cost approach, I'll use time use surveys, etc. Prabha might say, look, let's do an unconditional cash transfer. Justice Sridevan will say it might not be possible for the government. But at the same time, might be actually a good idea to pull it all together as a policy sort of piece, which is out there, for the government, because I don't think that all this holistically has been summarized elsewhere. And I thought that Prabha might be an interesting output as a part of these 3 days and the debate.
Well, don't put all the burden on Prabha. I think there is a joint responsibility here. We all provide, we all have arguments. Yeah. The important thing is to actually answer some of them. So thank you. I note that you're on board in preparing something like that. Prabha?
Yeah, I just, I don't think I've shifted my position as much as taken notes of all the cautionary comments from, people who have engaged with the state in its various forms and have looked at the macro perspective, micro perspective methodologies. So for me, it's been very enriching to actually hear the interdisciplinary debate. And I think I feel hopeful through the idea of trying to think about, coordinated platform, trying to think about a coordinated platform of women in several sectors, because I think everyone's working in silos, often approaching courts at different times, lobbying locally with different state governments in different ways. And I think it's just useful to bring together all this learning to then say whether this could at least be, an experiment in another state in the South. So if Shashi Tharoor, if Dr. Shashi Tharoor is, approving this, maybe, this is something that Kerala might consider, or, or indeed Kamal Hassan, if his alliance works out, and depending on the, election. So I think there is room, as has always been in the Indian context, for innovations to come from the state, for it to be then scaled up at the central level. But I just want to also just conclude by saying, the pandemic has brought up these kinds of issues elsewhere. And, I didn't mention it today, but this Marshall Plan for moms, in the US, I mean, of course, there are lots of organizations working there, as Selma has also mentioned, but I just want to note that even, a tech entrepreneur who's, extremely well connected, and, lots of men signing on to it, women signing, I don't think even they are asking just for a payout, on a monthly basis. I think they're asking for structural reform. And in the US context, it's in some ways worse than here, than in India. So, and asking for paid leave and pay equity and childcare. So I think that is the important thing, that people are not just, and it's also interesting to see the kinds of responses she has gotten in the US context, which is, the very individualistic denunciation. So I just think it's interesting to also compare the nature of objections in varied contexts to actually see that we might be in a better position to carry this project forward.
Right.
Just
so,
one.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
It's just 3-4 minutes, we might get cut off. So
so I'm going to wind up. Yeah, okay. Thank you for a really amazing discussion, not just from the panelists, but from the participants. There's some very rich comments, which, as I said, are long paras, but there's something to mull on. So if the project is to really take this forward, then I think there are points to be addressed or seen as support. I'd like to make the following points in closure. Firstly, that I think in any such, what we need to do is not necessarily go to A state or B state, but to prepare a much more model, if you like, a model, not a model act. In legal terms, you call it a model act or a policy thing, which discusses the issue, makes the case, answers the other side, or the issues that have been raised, that some of these can be answered and some not. I feel the issue of, so pros and cons need to be dealt with. I think the issue of trade-offs need to be centrally taken on board, that will there be a trade-off between this or there should not be, to make a case, trade-off between this and community of property, or trade-off between this and reduction of funds for reduction of drudgery, and so on. And there could be other trade-offs. I mean, Ritu's mentioned aspects of the macroeconomy, but parts of those are relating to potential trade-offs as well. And then I think thinking outside the box, because we always, as I said, I bring it back, we talk about the women's movement as a movement of large numbers, but the solutions we come up with are much more individualistic. An individual piece of property, an individual transfer, an individual ownership of equipment. I think we need to build into this the potential for the state funding much more group approaches to acquisition of reduction of care work mechanisms. Now, I would say mechanism, they can be multiple of different kinds. So with those words, which are, and then just to say, yes, I think, Shelma, may you be with us for a very long time, because here we all need that hand-holding. that experience and that internationalization. The particular one, I think, is about the question of the environment. Certainly, I think the protection of the environment and the building of a value system which is caring, which was at the heart of Selman's comments. I think it's a very long journey. And perhaps we should recognize that this is a journey, this is a process. Let's not always think of pros and cons as of today, but let's think of a journey with a much more longitudinal perspective as we would bring to environmental issues as well. So I'll give you the last word, Prabha.
No. Actually, I want Selma to have the last word because I think she didn't have a chance to make her final comment.
I thought she did, so that's why I didn't come back again to her. Of course.
Then it's fine.
Now that Shelma, did you want to give us a slogan to wind this up with?
Invest in caring, not killing is a slogan that we've had for many years. But I would like to make one other point, which is I am astonished at how much we have to learn from the Indian Wages for Housework movement, which I have heard in various speakers yesterday, day before, and today. And this is very good news for the international movement. We are in the process of building. It's going on. I see it. I feel it. And in the last couple of days, I heard it. Thank you so much.
Bravo. So we'll end with that. I will not add to it. And thank you, everybody, for joining in.